Welcome to the Palmer and Holsclaw show, where we are bridging faith and life by getting below the headlines and beyond the party lines. We're broadcasting in partnership with Missio Alliance, and today I didn't forget to put on the intro music, Sean.
That's very nice. It's very ambient. I was like, good, nice groove.
Last time I forgot to put it in there. I was bummed. But today's topic, we're talking about what's so bad about nationalism. What is so bad about nationalism? We have waiting in the wings a good friend, David Fitch. He's a personal friend of Sean and I's. I co-labored with Dave for a long time at Life on the Vine Community Church, and we also worked together at Northern Seminary. We'll introduce him a little bit more, but before we jump in, we are spending the next week. We're taking it off. I know everyone's so sad, but we're taking it off to talk about what is the future of this show, the Palmer and Holsclaw, the expansive future, the intergalactic future of this show. And so if you could all drop into the comments why you listen to the show, what are the reasons why you spend your valuable time with us 3 times a week, and maybe what you would like to hear us talk about. So drop those in the comments. So, Sean, do you have anything to say about Dr. David Fitch before we bring him on?
Well, he's really a troublesome character in the American church, and I'm glad that we're going to get a chance to interrogate him about some of his more divisive and controversial views, particularly around coffee. There are two things.
And hockey.
Hockey. I'm going to ask very many questions about hockey because it doesn't actually deserve to be talked about a whole lot more than 1 or 2 questions. But particularly coffee, hockey, and him being Canadian and denying it. So apparently, for some reason, for the entire time I've known him, I thought he was Canadian, probably because of his bad choices in hockey and coffee. But then maybe we can, everything, all of our views are perspectival. And so maybe there's a way in which we can understand where he comes from, the space habits of the world, being a lover of McDonald's coffee and hockey, which just being from the South just is not a thing. So I'd be interested in exploring that as we talk about nationalism today. But no, yes. Dave and I serve on the board for Missio Alliance, and it's been a great journey getting to know him and work alongside him in that endeavor. So I think we're in for a good show.
Absolutely. So we're going to welcome him in here. Dave Fitch, welcome to the Palmer and Holsclaw show.
I can't think of a better way to spend a Wednesday morning at 8 a.m. in Florida with 2 of my favorite dudes. And just to set Sean right, I grew up in Canada. I was conceived in Canada, but I was not born in Canada. So there's a lot of me that's Canadian, but I'm not. I'm an American citizen.
I legitimately thought until 2 months ago that you were Canadian. It's like I was shook when I was like, he's from Canada. I can't even remember what it was, a Twitter discussion. So for
set people right. But dudes, both of you dudes, and Holsclaw keeps wanting me to keep my face in the picture. I don't, whatever. But today is Canada Day. I just want to say Happy Canada Day. I believe that's a counter-nationalism tactic. Because some people in the United States right now might consider that an unpatriotic thing to do. It's a weak thing to do to say another country is good, beautiful. And so happy Canada Day to everybody. And Canada, would you mind taking us over? Because our healthcare system, not to mention our politics, is pretty messed up right now.
What do Canadians celebrate on Canada Day?
Well, it's been a while since I've actually lived in Canada, but they do things similar to July 4th here in the United States. They celebrate the country. It's, Canada. We don't need to go on and on about Canada because I don't know what I'm talking about.
No, because the reason I ask is a couple of years ago on the staff here at Ecclesia, one of our executive pastors it was raised in Canada, but would routinely forget Canadian holidays until I reminded him, like, "Hey, it's Thanksgiving. It's Canadian Thanksgiving." He's like, "Oh yeah, like I guess I should like call my parents or something today, right?" So,
And if
may,
he was under the age of 35, he probably didn't even know the Canadian Football League exists.
Oh, well, we'll have to have you on another time to talk about Canadian football. But the reason why we have you on today, and I'm actually going to leave all three faces up here, even though I'm going to go on a slightly extended monologue, is I'm going to give a defense. I'm going to try to give a defense of nationalism because, and then I want you guys both to talk about it. So when President Trump got elected, people were ready to leave. People on different timelines were saying, oh, I'm going to leave America. I'm going to go to Canada. Other people were saying, good, get rid of you, get out of here. I had pastors friends, saying like, oh, it's going to be so hard to pastor in America. And then other people saying, yeah, Trump's going to be here to save the American way of life. Some people are proud to be an American and others are not. So why the surge in talking about nationalism? Rich Lowry of the National Review just wrote a book called The Case for Nationalism. Yes.
I don't want to torpedo your show.
You're totally torpedoing my show.
But I just want to say Ed Stetzer had this thing put out on his blog today, Christianity Today.
Just today?
Yeah, just today. He said Lifeway Research, the group he used to be with, Southern Baptist. He surveyed 1,000 Protestant pastors. Almost 90% of churches he surveyed do something to honor the country on the Sunday morning of July 4th weekend. He said 53% of the Protestant pastors say our people love America more than God.
He actually says the pastors report that it seems to them that their people love America more than God. So seems is an important word.
So I'm gonna make a defense on why maybe that's not so bad. So Rusty Reno wrote a book called The Return of the Strong Gods, where he talks about how after World War II, we have only been serving what he calls the weak gods, that the liberal elite have been pushing the weak gods of openness, difference, and disintegration. The postmodern gods of homelessness are supposed to protect us from the strong gods that lead us to war, to international wars, of World War I, World War II. That these postmodern gods are supposed to protect us from strong loves that lead us toward hatred and violence and intolerance. And so he says the liberal elites are pushing this homelessness on all of us, and that the global populist and nationalist movements are rebellions against these liberal elite doctrines. And so he feels like that there is a return and a longing for a home. Biblically speaking, maybe we could say Genesis 10 speaks of the table of nations. And so God has made the nations from the sons of Noah. The Bible lists and affirms the distinctiveness of ancient nations, especially Israel and their borders. And God raises up various rulers for his sovereign bidding. Romans 13, as you guys well know, tells us to respect the authority that God has given us. And even Revelation 7:9 says that there will be worshipers from every nation, tribe, language, and tongue. And so God, in some sense, has a plan and respects nations, and so should we. And then someone like Roger Scruton, he's a British philosopher, he would say, humanly speaking, we must understand that we have a natural connection and a natural affection to the land we live in, that the land is a bounded territory of a specific history with specific customs and languages. And so all these things make up a sense of place, a sense of home. And Dave Fitch, I know you're a proponent of local living and being rooted in a place, in the places we call home. And so territories and nations are the place that we call home. And not only that, just let me finish, Dave, before you interrupt. Not only that, but a sense of home creates a sense of we before me. A sense of we, a sense of a group, a sense of identity before a sense of me. And so, in fact, maybe we could argue that to overcome the persistent individualism in Western societies, that we need to understand ourselves as a people connected to a land. And so Roger Scruton says that nationalism is this sense that we find our belonging in citizenship to a particular land. So it's not nationalism that's the problem. Nationalism does not lead toward racism. Nationalism is not fascism. It's imperialism that does all the violence in the world. And so could we just stop hating America? Dave Fitch, are you ready to stop hating America? I'm out.
All right, I'm going to ask you to do something that I ask, generally speaking, everybody in classroom. Could you summarize? I mean, there's about 10 things that were said there that are actually, some of them are deeply offensive.
I didn't even bring up coffee.
But could you summarize in 2 sentences what you think the main point of Scruton or Reno?
The main point of the
feeling about it.
The main point of the defense of nationalism is that nationalism does not lead toward racism, does not lead toward fascism. It actually is a natural part of human nature to love the place you came from, and therefore it actually protects against violence, and it respects boundaries between peoples and things. And so it's only natural that we would love the place we came from, and it shouldn't be demonized. We should not demonize nationalism as something evil, but rather it's just natural. It's a natural part of human nature.
Well, I think
I'm not saying I agree with everything I just said 5 minutes ago, but I'm just trying to give it a fair shake.
And what's the name of that book again, Jeff? You held it up there for a second. Did you?
Roger Scruton is How to Be a Conservative. I'll drop that in the links as you guys talk. And then Rusty R.R. Reno is The Return of the Strong Gods, Nationalism, Populism, and the Future of the West.
So I could start out by saying something like Roger Scruton and his theology of culture sounds like the Volk culture of Nazi Germany. I could start out by saying that, but I'm not going to do that, because actually there are some things in there that are, helpful and or true, and I probably agree with. But as with everything, Roger's not. I mean, is that what nationalism is? I don't know if that's what nationalism is. Hey! When the United States and Canada are playing hockey in the World Cup, tournaments, I'm cheering for one of them, and I'm actually proud of the country. I'm not. I cheer for Canada, by the way. I don't cheer.
Yeah, I put that together pretty quickly. That was...
but there's so an affection for some of your cultural institutions, and a certain amount of enjoyment and pride towards what's been accomplished. I don't think that's a bad thing. What happens is when we start to elevate the government. I'll put it this way. We start to elevate the government and our nation state and put it in the place of the role of God and Jesus Christ as Lord, ruler, and King. I just spit on my computer. Forgive me.
Broadcast.
We elevate that and we replace. That's what I call. That is the definition of idolatry. And so when we are asking the United States of America, its government and nation state, to do things that only Jesus can do, I call that idolatry. Comments?
I'm kicking it over to Sean.
Here's the I find that really interesting. So because one, I guess his definition of nationalism is actually pretty robust and complicated. But what he's actually describing isn't nationalism by definition. What he's actually describing is national identity. And there is such a thing as a national identity that is typically pretty healthy. And the problem in the discussions with nationalism right now is that everyone decides that nationalism is whatever they need it to be in the moment and don't look at the actual definition of what nationalism is. And so part of the discussion that needs to happen is we've got to have some sort of agreement about terms. Like, what does nationalism mean? And even if you were to sort of research and try to uncover what it is people mean by that a part of nationalism historically, not in our present moment, it's very much like defining the word evangelical. But the problem is now that everybody that uses the word doesn't know what it means. Nationalism historically does have components about the exclusion to the goodness of other nations. So it's your national self-interest to the exclusion and detriment of other nations. Like that's what the actual term means. Now, what happens and what's happening now is that we want to say nationalism is an affinity for my country, a love for my country. Like one of my heroes when I was a kid, just a civil rights hero, is Medgar Evers. Medgar Evers was shot. He was a civil rights hero, shot in his front yard. And he used to say, 'cause he's from Jackson, my dad was his paper boy, right? He used to say, I'm going to heaven one day, but I'm going to be going from Mississippi. Like he loved Mississippi for reasons that escape me today, right? Like why would anyone want to stay in Mississippi who had a car who could leave? And so that's a love for place, but included in that love of place was a determination to make that place a better place, not to exalt that place as the one place in the universe that had arrived that was centered in goodness and holy. And that's the difference between nationalism now. There are nationalists now who would say that America is the model in terms of who we are at this moment, not in terms of our aspirations, and every place else just kind of sucks. So I love Olympic opening ceremonies. And here's what I love. I never feel more patriotic than watching the Olympics, because largely speaking, when there are African nations who come into the arena, their athletes come in, and this is not 100% true. Most of them look exactly the same. When there are Asian nations that come in, most of them look exactly the same. Nordic countries come in, most of them look exactly the same. And then when the American athletes enter in, they look so different. And I love that. Like I love American aspirations. Someone on Twitter asked me the other day what I thought about why I loved America. And what I love about America is its aspirations much more than its history. But that's national identity. That's not nationalism. And that's the distinction that too few people are making. Does that make sense? Am I alone in that?
That makes a lot of sense. And it's the exact opposite use that someone like Rich Lowry in A Case for Nationalism makes. Is he actually argues against national identity as striving toward ideals and says, no, it's not that. It's actually just a bounded territory and the customs and the history that create the national identity. And so and this is where I think defining nationalism is really important, because I think what you're saying, Sean, and I think how Martin Luther King Jr. and the civil rights movement asked is they were actually calling all of America to actually live into its ideals for all people, and trying to show that with Jim Crow South, that those ideals were being violated, that we were kind of not being true to our own ideals. But other people, and I think a lot of people who are pro the idea of nationalism, they take that idealism out and they say, no, it's a local territory. And so we need to have closed borders, and closed borders are okay. And things like that.
The interesting project for all of us when having the discussions about nationalism is just to simply ask our conversation partners, what do you mean by that? Mm-hmm. And you will hear national identity, not nationalism. Because if you were to say to them, so what you mean is your nation, whatever it is, to the exclusion of and detriment to other nations, they would say no. And what happens in the conversation is everyone wants to define the term themselves, which is a extraordinarily liberal philosophical project, right? Like the terms only mean what I want them to mean right now. Mm-hmm. Instead of saying, no, this is actually what it means. And let's deal with words have meaning and history, right? I mean, the Nazis are always really easy, punching bags. But I mean, it's the Nationalist Party, right? And so a triumphant German Europe means that all other nations in its realm have to suffer for the cause of Germany. And I don't think that's what people mean. Like, that's not what.
Not generally.
That's not. Yeah. When I talk with people and they say, well, what's so bad about nationalism? They don't mean what the word actually means. What they mean is national identity. And obviously the people I talk to could be a subset and not representative. So I'm open to that. I'm
going to bounce this back to Dave. But Linda, thanks so much for your comment. She says, maybe we could compare and contrast nationalism with exceptionalism. And I think that Nazi nationalism was that exceptionalism, that we are, the Aryan race. I think some people, though, in common usage do have an understanding that America is an exceptional country, that focusing on its bad history is to just miss all the great and wonderful things that we've done. But Dave, as the Betty E. Linner Chair of Evangelical Theology, doing theology, Betty R. Oh, sorry. Who teaches on church and culture quite often. We've just been talking about maybe just the concept of nationalism, but you brought up idolatry earlier on. So however we define nationalism.
Can I just say this identity versus borders, state?
Yes.
I'm not completely sold on that. My question is, my question to Sean Palmer and Geoff Holsclaw today.
I was going to give you the questions. Come on, you're turning it on us.
My question is this, once we align our identity with what Alistair McIntyre called a telephone utility, what should be a telephone utility company, we come dangerously close to be willing to kill for it. We become when we start talking, this aspirationally is the most exceptional country in the world, and I love its aspirations. I'm worried that identity is the link to death, the link to picking up arms and fighting somebody who is not us. And if Jesus is my identity, Jesus is Lord, and the ruling reign in the kingdom of God is my identity, I will not go and kill a Christian in Canada. I will not go kill a Christian in Russia for the sake of my country. What do you think?
Is there a question? Did I miss the question?
Yeah, the question was, what do you think? What do you think? I'm asking, I'm saying, I'm wondering, so much of identity in the United States is such a crucial way we think about ourselves, and we build up antagonisms over against people who either question our identity or have a different identity than us, which threatens our identity. I'm talking about sexuality. I'm actually talking about racism. I'm talking about religion. And now I'm talking about nationalism. And so much of it creates an antagonism, which creates the possibility, creates the probability of war. And I'm just asking about the link of identity to violence.
We go a lot of different ways on that one.
Yeah, I think that's a question that needs to be explored for sure. Like, what is the link between identity? And I'm not sure that I have a good answer or response for that. To go to war, to kill, simply because my nation sends me to kill is highly problematic. If there are greater things at stake, I think people would answer that question differently. There are some folks who, under no circumstance, regardless, part of the national identity, right, in America is you can freely choose to be a pacifist, right? And part of national identity is whether it's true or not is another discussion, is the defense of other ideals that might be at risk in other nations. So there are some folks who might readily go to war. And that's one of the discernible problems with just being human, is at what lever do you pull at any specific time in the service of greater things. to say always, never, no is one way that some people go, but that's actually part of our national identity, right? And this is figuring that out has also been a part of national identity. I mean, this goes back to whether, the first international conflict for George Washington, like, are we going to support France's Civil War, and how are we going to do that or not? Like, that's part of our conversation. And so part of that national identity is being a kind of people who put ourselves into situations where we have to have those conversations, and we aren't automatically leveraged one way or the other. I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that's what makes it difficult, particularly in America, because part of the identity is having really hard conversations about the identity itself, and that it's not finished. The identity itself is not yet formed.
So, Dave, back to you. What should our Christian identity be speaking to us in the midst of thinking about national identity or nationalism? How does following Christ make a difference then? Can we just be an American and a Christian and just figure it out as we go? Or is there something that you brought up idolatry? Let's go back to this question of idolatry.
Well, okay. So one of the great things about being a Christian is we are given the identity, or what post-structuralists call the subjectivity, the wherewithal to be somebody who keeps government in its lane. A person like me, who's a committed Anabaptist, doesn't want to get rid of government. We want to keep government in its lane. Romans 13, be subordinate to your government, respect your government, is not an invitation to make your government your identity. It's actually keeping your government in its lane. It's a long story there, but if you read Romans 12, it's all about the community as being the center of life. And now when we get to government in Romans 13:1, it's about, okay, how do we live peaceably and even in resistance? Because we know that in Romans, the book of Romans was written at a time when, at least part of the time, the Roman government was persecuting Christians. It was hardly, Romans 13:1 was hardly, be subject to your government, was hardly an invitation to go get killed by your government. It was saying God will use government to accomplish things anyways, even when it's using force and violence in ways which God does not work directly. So my main point here is government is provisional. It's Holsclaw can explain this probably better than I. For some of us, it's post-lapsarian. The reason for its being is because of the fall. It's preservatory in function. It keeps things. Luther was big on this. Keeps things in line. He did it very poorly, by the way. Luther, poorly. Don't read him. But anyways, whereas the redemptive work, and now I'm talking not just individual work of redeeming the soul, an individual Christian, the redemptive work of social realities that are systematically encumbered by sin, evil, anger, antagonism, brokenness, violence. That work will be done by the rule and reign of the presence of Christ at work in the world. And so we got to keep government in its lane. To say Christian nation is to remove government from being in its limitations and its lane. And it almost makes the work of the church be put on the government. I believe that's nationalism. I believe that's a sin. And one of the great ways Christianity changes, Jesus Christ changes how we live in relation to the government. It's like being a Canadian in the United States. It's so great. Now, FYI, folks, my parents moved from Owen Sound, Ontario 2 months before I was born. So I was born in Elmhurst, Illinois. And then they moved back to Hamilton, Ontario. My father grew up in Ottawa and Winnipeg. So I have a lot of Canadian heritage, but I'm still an American. But I can draw on that Canadian thing. I'm here, but I don't have to be. I can live here for the good of the country, for the good of where I live, but I don't have to see this as my primary allegiance. My primary allegiance is to Jesus Christ, and I will cooperate in any way. Bonhoeffer called it the penultimate to the ultimate. Whenever the penultimate work, the provisional work of the government, lines up with the ultimate work of Christ. Holsclaw, can you explain anything I just said and make sense?
Hey, this is not our old podcast where I have to clean up your messes, okay? So, that was it's still going on, but with another co-host, the theology
on tap, on mission.
But I would say I would go St. Augustine. After the fall of Rome, after it was sacked, he wrote a book called The City of God, and he talked about how Christians are on a pilgrimage toward our ultimate city, which is the heavenly city of God coming down into the world. And so we all of our relationships are provisional with the city of man, with the human city, the earthly city. And so I tell people, I'm glad to be an American. I often talk about being from California more than being an American, right? If you know me or talk to me for very long.
In fact, you haven't lived there in like 25 years.
That's true. But my root identity is there. And I tell people that the long-term survival significance or world impact of America is much less of a concern of mine than the global impact and witness of the church. And so how do the question for me, and maybe I'll bounce this to Sean to kind of wrap us up, is can we affirm and even appreciate an American or Californian or a Mississippian identity and hold that as true as part of us, but not let it override our identity in Christ and our calling? And I feel that that there is a discipleship moment that needs to be happening probably more rigorously, especially among kind of white churches, that our national identity might be or probably has overridden our Christian identity on all sorts of issues. Or the tagline of this show is that we're trying to get beyond the headlines and beyond the party lines, is that we have too much identity discipleship coming to us from Fox News or from MSNBC, and that our identity is too closely aligned to what Republicans should or Democrats should be doing or not be doing. And our Christian identity is so thin and so flimsy that this is a huge discipleship crisis. And so that's my concern when it comes to nationalism, is not that we should hate our country. It's just that we don't love Jesus enough. What do you think, Sean? Let's land this plane.
Yeah. So when I think about nationalism, national identity, for me, because I talk about this a lot, like being born in Mississippi, being raised in Georgia, for me, what that means is that functions in a formative sense, but not in a performative sense, which is like I am shaped by the place that I am from. And, I mentioned this before. My dad was an American history teacher. I am like an armchair American historian, American history buff. Like I've read more books than most folks who think they know history. And what that means is it informs how I function, but it is not performative in the sense that I am performing out of that identity. Like my performative identity comes from my deeply held belief that Jesus is the ruler of this world. And so the things that I do in the world, the way I perform, is because Jesus is king, not because I'm American, which I can do then anywhere. And I can look at my neighbors to the south or to the north and see them not as some sort of separate kind of foreign-ish person or type, because Jesus is Lord of all. And so I have as much allegiance to those people as I do to people in Mississippi or Georgia or here in Texas. I'm performing from a different place than I was formed. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the healthy way to go about it. And if you want to know if you're healthy or unhealthy, at least in my estimation, like, why do people get so defensive about nationalism? Mm-hmm. or being caught like what is at the root? Like, what is at stake? There are many Christians, in my experience, who functionally believe that they would cease to have a flourishing life if America didn't exist. And it would definitely be different. Like, don't need to be negative about that. But it's almost as if they can't see a world in which the American system isn't demonstrably at play in the world. And I think that's a problem. What say you, Fitch?
Yeah, Dave, why don't you land the plane here? What is the discipleship moment for our Christian identities in the midst of the swirl of nationalism. And I'm just going to post this thought by Rebecca here, Dave. Maybe if you see this, she says, I believe that we would need to be an intentional internal journey as our identities are so deeply taught and rewarded. Quite frankly, many folks don't want to take the time or the energy to separate their national identity from their interpersonal identity. So, Dave, how can we have identities? What's the discipleship moment around Jesus?
Let's not confuse the stake we have in our government and in our culture as being ultimate, but we do have a stake in it. But we operate as exiles or citizens from another place in a strange kind of way. Nonetheless, just like the diaspora, Jeremiah says, we're here to flourish and to be part of a culture. But this culture is local. It's not global. Willie Jennings can lead us through this, Christian Imagination, that famous kind of book, classic now. How whiteness, Euro-colonialism got interwoven with the gospel in this strange way, which separated the gospel and then implanted it in a culture and aligned it. That was Willie Jennings' work. It's a brilliant exposition of that, but we need to unwind that process. So when we see a statue of Robert E. Lee being torn down, and we feel some kind of, us white people, maybe we feel resentment or anger, or why are you doing this, or how dare you assault? We need to unwind that. Sit with somebody. Why does that bother me? What part of me has an allegiance with whatever that statue means or represents? And can we allow God to actually allow us to repent, lament a past that in one way or another us white people have a history with, so that we can realign our identity with Christ and become salt in this world, light in the darkness. I think that unwinding, I guess I'd like to hear what you got to say, both you guys. Every time a statue is being torn down and you feel it's an attack against my country and its history, and that's an opportunity for discipleship. But you got to do it not in your own head, because then you'll just echo chamber yourself to getting more angry or whatever, re-up whatever is already going on. You need to do it with at least 2 or 3 other people, maybe preferably someone who's not the same color as you are.
Yeah. Can I just say something that's a fact that will hack a lot of people off?
Do it.
Okay. So I grew up in Stone Mountain, Georgia. On Stone Mountain, there is a carving there in the side of the granite, and it's Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and Jefferson Davis, right? Okay. That's fact number 1. Fact number 2 is that carving is a monument to what those 3 men did in a country that no longer exists. Those are 2 facts. Like, you can assign whatever you want to those facts, but we have monuments in this country to people, not for what they did for this country, but for what they did to another country, for another country. How appropriate that is, we can have a discussion about, but that is an undeniable fact, right? Robert E. Lee is not remembered for what he did for the United States of America.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things, Don,
it's just a fact of history. So there's a statue of George Washington in it too. So we can have that conversation. Let's not get away from those facts. That Confederate monuments are not monuments to what people did in service of our country.
And that's and maybe we could wrap it up with this, that's the difficult conversation about national identity in America, and people, I had a link and I can't find it, talk about how there's really 11 different nations wrapped up in one country called the United States of America, that there's all sorts of different national identities that they don't really overlap. And so it is a large, sprawling, difficult question. But I think the thing that I want all of us to leave with, and I think you two would agree too, is that however it is we understand our national identities, our statewide identities, our regional identities, they all have to come underneath. They have to come under the lordship of Jesus and the way of Christ. And that it feels like there's still a lot of work to do in at least I'll just speak my kind of segment of the churches, the more conservative and certainly white churches, that we have not disentangled and made Christ's lordship big enough.
Hey, Jeff, can I have one last word?
Yes, you can. And just before you do, Rebecca gave me an amen on that one. Thank you so much, Rebecca. So yes, go.
Way to go, Rebecca.
Let me just show that. There we go. Amen.
How do you know? How you know it's for you?
That's true. I mean, it could have been kind of delayed. It could be on a 2-minute delay. So, but I'm in control of all this stuff. So, boom, I'm going to say it was for me. Dave, last sentence.
I would just say, this is a key moment for us, all of us, to deal with who our country is, where we're going, all these statue issues that John just alluded to with his example, but also the church has got work to figure out our own history and where we went wrong and where we need to go right, where we need to be more faithful. And I'm writing a book about this, by the way. It's called Right Side of History or Wrong Side of Power. So anyways, these are our moments of discipleship. I think it's great that we're having this discussion, and let's dig in and allow Jesus to work in and through every statue that's being raised. Every opportunity is an opportunity for us to become more faithful to Christ and his lordship.
Well, with that, thank you everybody for joining in to the Palmer and Holsclaw show. Thanks so much, Dave Fitch, for being with us. Please like, share this video. The Facebook and the YouTube streams, they all are so crowded and no one's going to see this unless you share it. So, and subscribe. As Sean was saying, hit that button, subscribe so you don't miss any future ones. Thank you again to Miss You Alliance. Thank you, Dave, for all your hard work. And
I'm going to subscribe if I can figure out how to do it.
We'll show you how to do it. Have a great day. And we will be talking on Friday about what is freedom for, something like that. So tune in again. We will talk.
See you Friday.